I wake up to the warm morning light filtering through the shutters of our bedroom. The room is filled with a soft golden glow, but I feel uneasy. The sun's rays draw patterns on the wooden floor, but their beauty feels distant, as if it exists for someone else. I descend the creaky staircase of our house. This house has always symbolized something greater to me: success, stability. Michael and I have spent 10 years here. His presence lingers in every corner: books on the shelf, the neatly hung suits in the wardrobe. But Michael himself is here less and less. The kitchen looks just as it always does. The coffee machine hums quietly, filling the room with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I take a sip, lean against the table, and gaze out at the garden through the window. Michael is already gone. His schedule is always packed, and our conversations increasingly boil down to formalities: bills, weekly plans, the roof repairs. He's kind, caring, but behind that calmness is a void, a cold, uncharted ocean stretching between us. Maybe I'm just bored. Or is this all normal? I wonder, but no answers come. Questions about meaning and joy, which I try to push away, return with renewed force every morning. I feel like an insignificant part of my own life, as if someone else is steering this routine. A drop of coffee falls onto the pristine white tablecloth. I can't even muster the energy to wipe it away. Everything feels so pointless. The garden comes alive with the sound of birds, but for me, it's just background noise. I catch myself thinking, when was the last time I felt joy? True, unbridled joy that fills every fiber of your being. Those memories seem hidden behind a thick wall. Deep down, a thought gnaws at me. Maybe it's my fault? Am I too demanding? Or, on the contrary, too accustomed to this life? The doorbell rings, startling me out of my thoughts. It sounds unexpectedly loud, as though it comes from another world. Whoever I've become now, this moment tears through my routine. I open the door. Standing there is Daniel, my stepbrother, whom I haven't seen in many years. He looks tired, but his eyes hold a kind of gentle warmth. He's carrying an old travel backpack, and his smile reminds me of the last time I saw him, back when I still believed I could truly be happy. "Hello, Anna," he says, tilting his head slightly. His voice is calm, almost tender, and there's something in it I haven't heard in a long time. Something real. I invite him in, and from that moment, something in my life begins to change. Daniel appears on the doorstep with a casual ease, as if our meeting is just another morning in a long series of ordinary days. But his face tells a different story. There's weariness in his eyes, as though he spent the night on the road, and a slight awkwardness, the kind that clings to those unaccustomed to visiting others. "Thank you for letting me in, Anna," he says quietly as he steps inside, his voice soft, almost apologetic. I nod, still unsure what to say. His arrival, like a gust of wind, has brought with it the scent of old memories. I notice the way his gaze sweeps over the house. He must find this sterile order strange. Everything perfectly in place, as though we live in a museum rather than a home. "Michael mentioned you're going through a rough patch." I begin cautiously as we make our way to the living room. The words feel foreign in my mouth. Michael had told me that Daniel was facing difficulties, but the details remained vague. Daniel smirks, removing his jacket and carefully draping it over the back of a chair. That's putting it mildly. After the divorce, I felt completely unmoored. I figured a change of scenery might be the best thing I could do for myself. I place a cup of tea in front of him and sit down across from him. He looks slightly lost, but not broken. His manner has always been restrained, as if he was trying to conceal more than he revealed. We exchange a few remarks about his journey, the weather, but the conversation stalls. It's not that we don't know what to talk about. It's more that we're both still adjusting to sharing the same space again. When Daniel lifts his eyes, I see a question in them he doesn't quite dare to ask. There's curiosity there, a hint of surprise, even concern. It's as if he's trying to figure out who I've become after all these years. "How are you?" he suddenly asks, breaking the silence. The question catches me off guard. A simple phrase, but somehow I sense more sincerity in it than I've heard in years. I'm fine. I respond automatically, but even I can hear the hollowness in my words. Daniel notices too. He doesn't look away, as if waiting for me to say more on my own. But I can't. He takes a sip of his tea, leans back in his chair, and shifts the topic. You know, I always envied your house. As a kid, I imagined having something like this. A big, cozy place where I could just be myself. I smile, but his words carry a bittersweet undertone. After all, I haven't felt like myself in this house for a long time. The conversation drifts back to safer topics, and I, not wanting to prolong the awkwardness, show him the room where he'll be staying. Thank you, Anna, he says, setting his backpack by the door. I'll do my best not to trouble you and Michael. His words are as careful as his steps down the hallway. But I feel that his very presence has already shifted something in me. I don't yet know what, but this day will leave a mark. When I close the door to my bedroom that night, I lie awake staring at the ceiling. My home no longer feels so quiet. The next morning begins as usual. I wake up early. Michael is already gone for work, leaving a short note on the table. Don't forget about the meeting with the gardener. Love, Michael. His love has long since become a habitual ending, devoid of depth. I stand by the stove, brewing coffee, wondering how to spend the day. The silence is broken by the sound of footsteps. I turn around. Daniel appears in the kitchen. He looks slightly unshaven, but his hair is neatly combed back. He's wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, and everything about his appearance seems simpler, more natural than this house. Good morning, he says, smiling slightly. Good morning, coffee? I offer, pouring a second cup. He nods and sits at the table, watching me. We're silent as I place the cup in front of him. Then he breaks the quiet. Do you still drink your coffee with milk and cinnamon? I smile faintly. You remember? Of course, he replies. It's one of those small things that sticks in your memory for no particular reason. You were always different. You had your own rhythm, your own way of seeing life. His words make me pause. It's been a long time since someone talked about me like that. Michael often notices details in the house, but not in me. I make a light joke to diffuse the moment. Now my rhythm is breakfast, the gardener, and a to-do list. Daniel smiles, but something like regret flickers in his eyes. He takes a sip of coffee and then remarks, Does that work for you? His question is simple, but it unsettles me. I look away out the window. The garden is bathed in sunlight. The grass glistens with morning dew. Everything looks perfect, but I feel something breaking inside. I don't know, I answer honestly, surprising even myself. Usually, I'm quick to say everything's fine, that I'm grateful for my life. But with him, I don't feel like lying. Daniel nods as though he understands more than I've said. He sets his cup down on the table, not rushing to speak again. His silence isn't uncomfortable. Instead, it gives me space. I know what it's like to lose yourself, he finally says. After the divorce, I spent a long time trying to figure out what makes me happy. But it turned out to be harder than I thought. His words touch something deep inside me. They feel like he's talking not only about himself, but also about me. I look up and meet his eyes. They're sincere, calm, but with a faint shadow of sadness. You didn't come here just because of me, did you? I ask. He smiles, shrugging slightly. I came to start over. Maybe here it'll be easier to figure out what's next. We talk a little more, shifting to lighter topics. Childhood, random memories, funny moments. His presence stirs something forgotten in me. Ease, informality, warmth. When he leaves, I remain alone in the kitchen, clutching my cup. His words linger in my mind. And for the first time in a long while, I feel that maybe, just maybe, something in my life can truly change. A few days later, Daniel suggested we take a walk around the city. I don't know anything about this place, Anna. Show me Boston. Tell me what's interesting here. His request was simple, even mundane, but for some reason, it struck a chord in me. It had been ages since I last wandered through the city or noticed its beauty. Maybe he was right. Maybe I needed to step outside the boundaries of my routine. We set out early in the morning when the streets were still half empty and the air was crisp. In the heart of Boston, everything came alive. Historic buildings, cobblestone streets, coffee shops filling with their first customers of the day. I showed Daniel familiar spots that once felt significant to me. See that building? I said, pointing to a grand red brick structure. That's one of the oldest libraries. I used to come here when I was in college. It was my sanctuary. Daniel looked at the building, then at me. Did you have dreams back when you were in school? I hesitated. The question felt too direct. Of course, but dreams change over time, you know. Dreams should change your life, not the other way around, he replied, and there was something profound in his words. We continued our walk along the waterfront. The still water reflected the sunlight, and the distant cries of seagulls echoed in the air. Daniel kept asking questions, curious about details I'd stopped noticing long ago. His attention to small things was infectious, and I found myself starting to notice them too. Details that had once faded into the background. We passed by a street artist sketching portraits. Daniel suggested we stop. Let's get a portrait done. It's part of the local vibe, isn't it? I laughed, but agreed. We sat down side by side, and the artist began working. While he sketched, Daniel reminisced about our childhood. Do you remember when we built that fort in the garden? It was the first place where I felt important. You said no one but us was allowed inside. I laughed, memories flooding back. We really did keep our secrets there. It was our little refuge. The artist finished the portrait. In it, we both looked slightly odd, but there was a charm to it. We laughed and moved on. At some point, I realized I was smiling. Truly smiling. It had been so long since I felt this lighthearted. The walk, though seemingly ordinary, brought me back to life. Daniel asked about my hobbies, my dreams, and what made me happy. At first, his questions felt unexpected, but I found myself starting to think about them. We returned home late in the evening. The city was slowly settling down to sleep, and I felt as though something inside me had awakened, something I thought had been forgotten long ago. Evening falls. Michael is once again working late. Somewhere upstairs, I hear the faint creak of the floor. Daniel must already be settled in his room. I stand by the bookshelf, running my fingers over the spines of novels I haven't opened in ages. Just as I'm about to abandon the idea, Daniel appears in the doorway. Want to watch a movie? He asks, leaning against the doorframe. He's holding a bag of popcorn, so out of place in our perfectly curated home that I can't help but smile. A movie? I don't even remember the last time I watched anything, I admit, feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and anticipation. Well, then it's about time, he says, motioning for me to follow. We settle onto the couch in the living room. He picks an old classic, a comedy guaranteed to make even the grimmest person laugh. The first few minutes are a little awkward, but then I forget everything else. I laugh, really laugh, at the simple yet genuine scenes, something I haven't done in what feels like forever. At some point, I notice Daniel isn't watching the screen anymore. His gaze is fixed on me. What? I ask, feeling my face heat up. You're so real when you laugh, he says, as if it's the most natural observation in the world. His words catch me off guard. I can't even remember the last time someone said something like that to me. His voice is sincere, without any hidden agenda. Just a statement of fact. I try to steer the conversation away. And what about you? What makes you happy? I ask, as he turns his eyes back to the screen. Daniel pauses for a moment before replying. I used to think I knew the answer. Work, family. But then I realized happiness isn't something you check off a list. It's a moment, like this one, when everything feels simple and right. I fall silent. His words are so straightforward, yet they leave a mark. I think about my life, about the rigid schedule that hasn't left room for anything as simple and right as this in years. The movie ends, but we remain on the couch. The conversation turns more personal. Daniel opens up about his life after the divorce, his fears, his attempts to rediscover himself. I listen, feeling a connection between us that's hard to put into words. It's not just a bond. It's understanding, sincerity, something that feels so rare. You know, Anna, he says, looking directly at me, sometimes you have to stop and ask yourself, are you really living or just existing? His words hit me like a challenge, and I realize I already know the answer, though I'm afraid to admit it to myself. When he heads upstairs to bed, I stay in the living room, staring at the darkening garden outside the window. My world no longer feels as stable as it once did, but this strange, unfamiliar sensation makes me feel alive. The next day, I meet Amy, my best friend, at a small cafe near downtown. It had been a while since we last saw each other. In recent months, I had often found excuses to avoid meeting up. But today, I suddenly felt the urge to talk, even though I wasn't entirely sure what about. Amy arrives on time, as always. Her smile is warm, but her gaze is piercing. She has a way of seeing through the things I try to hide. We sit at a table by the window, and the waiter brings our usual order. A cappuccino for her? Black tea for me. You look different, she says, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. It sounds like an innocent remark, but there's something more in her tone. Different? I try to smile, but a wave of unease rises within me. You seem alive, she continues, taking a sip of her coffee. Before it was like you were behind glass. Now you're not. I avert my gaze, focusing on my cup. Amy has always been too perceptive. Maybe I'm just sleeping better. I joke, but she doesn't buy it. Anna, what's going on? Her voice turns serious. She's always had a way of asking questions that make it impossible to avoid the truth. I hesitate, but then decide to open up. Daniel, my stepbrother, is staying with us for a while. We've been talking a lot, and I've started thinking about my life, about whether I'm even happy. Amy says nothing, her eyes fixed on my face. She's waiting for me to go on. Michael is wonderful. He's kind, caring, but I feel nothing. We're like two housemates sharing a roof. Everything is too convenient, too familiar. And with Daniel, I'm starting to see the world differently. The words spill out, unbidden, like a flood I've been holding back for far too long. When I finish, I feel exposed, as though I've laid bare a part of myself I hadn't even acknowledged. Amy leans forward, placing her hand over mine. Do you understand where this could lead? I do, I whisper. You can't live just for convenience or out of fear of change, she says. Her voice is gentle, but there's a firmness to it. I'm not saying you have to do anything drastic right now, but you need to be honest with yourself. That's important. I nod, and tears well up in my eyes. But instead of breaking down, I feel something else. Relief. It's as though someone has finally voiced what I was too afraid to admit. As we leave the cafe, Amy hugs me tightly. You deserve to be happy, Anna. Don't forget that. On the way home, her words echo in my mind, blending with memories of my conversations with Daniel. Perhaps it's time to stop lying to myself. On Saturday morning, Daniel strolled into the kitchen with a newfound lightness that I'd started to notice in him lately. He held his phone in one hand, smiling like a child with an exciting plan. Hey, Anna, how about an adventure? I found a farmer's market nearby. Let's go pick up something fresh. They say they have amazing cheese. His enthusiasm caught me off guard, but it was unexpectedly delightful. Michael never cared for spontaneity. Everything always had to be meticulously planned. Why not? I replied, surprising even myself. We drove to the market on the outskirts of the city. Rows of colorful tents lined a dusty road, the air rich with the aromas of fresh bread, spices, and herbs. People wandered with baskets, chatting with vendors, sampling slices of apples and chunks of cheese. Look, this reminds me of what Grandma used to buy, Daniel said, holding up a jar of honey. His voice was warm, as if he'd been transported to another time. I glanced at the jar, then at him. You remember her honey? She always said it could cure any cold. We moved along, laughing and chatting about everything. The strange names of vegetables, the shouts of vendors, the odd shapes of pumpkins. I felt a lightness I hadn't in a long time, as if I'd momentarily left my worries behind. One of the vendors offered us a sample of cheese. Best cheese in the area, he declared, handing us small slices on wooden sticks. Daniel took a piece and held it out to me. You'll like this. Try it. I smiled and took a bite. The cheese was indeed delicious, salty with a hint of nuttiness. You're right, I said, and he nodded approvingly. We bought a few items and stopped at a flower stall. I was ready to walk past, but Daniel lingered. He picked up a bouquet of sunflowers, turned to me and said, These flowers look like they're glowing. Let's get them. They'll brighten up your home. I couldn't refuse. The sunflowers were simple yet vibrant, radiating a cheerfulness I hadn't noticed in flowers before. When we returned home, I placed them in a vase at the center of the table. They seemed to light up the entire room. The day was so simple, yet so special. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and I began seeing the world differently. Ordinary moments I'd once dismissed as trivial suddenly felt meaningful. That evening, while Daniel read in his room, I walked over to the vase of sunflowers. Their golden petals reminded me of something I'd long forgotten, the kind of joy that springs from the simplest moments. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I flipped through a book I had pulled from the shelf, but the text felt hollow. The words lost their meaning, turning into dull black lines. I felt an invisible emptiness closing in around me. The house, once familiar, suddenly seemed foreign and cold. The clock struck midnight, and I decided to go downstairs. In the kitchen, under the dim light of the night lamp, I found myself sitting with a cup of hot tea, staring out the window. It was then I heard soft footsteps. Turning around, I saw Daniel. He looked groggy but concerned. You can't sleep either? He asked, sitting across from me. Apparently not, I replied with a forced smile, knowing I couldn't hide behind polite phrases with him. Daniel looked at me intently, as if trying to read my thoughts. Are you okay, Anna? His question was gentle, but it struck a nerve. I felt something tighten inside me. Honestly, I said, averting my gaze, gripping my cup tighter. I can't remember the last time I was okay. He didn't respond right away, giving me space to continue. But his silence felt like an invitation, a gentle nudge. Michael is wonderful. He's caring, successful, stable. We've built a life we should be proud of. But I feel like I don't exist in that life. It's as if everything I do is just accommodating circumstances. His schedule, the version of life I thought we were supposed to have. I paused, feeling the words I'd been holding inside for so long begin to pour out. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it felt like a release. Sometimes I think that if this house disappeared tomorrow and I woke up somewhere else, I wouldn't even feel the difference, I added quietly. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He sat there in silence, watching me with such warmth that it coaxed me to go on. I don't know when it started. Maybe I've always lived this way, thinking I was doing the right thing. But every year it gets harder to pretend I'm okay with it. Why don't you tell him? He asked gently. I've tried. But how do you explain to someone that you've lost yourself when they genuinely believe they're doing everything right? He works for us. He tries. And I just can't be happy. Daniel clasped his hands on the table but said nothing. His silence wasn't indifferent. It was attentive, warm, the kind that only someone close to you could hold. You deserve to be heard, Anna, he finally said. You deserve to live in a way that makes you feel alive. I looked at him. His words were simple, but they lightened the burden I carried. For the first time, I felt as though someone truly understood. That night, I returned to my room, but sleep still didn't come. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling, turning his words over in my mind. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel empty, just a strange, tentative hope. A week later, Daniel suggested a trip out of town. I need to pick up some things from my old job, he said over morning coffee. His tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of emotion, as though the trip meant more to him than he was willing to admit. I agreed. The day was clear, with soft sunlight spreading across the asphalt as we drove down the highway. Daniel was quiet for most of the ride, focused on the road. I didn't try to break the silence, instead enjoying the scenery outside the window. Fields and small houses passed by, like fragments of memories from another time. We arrived at an old building, a modest warehouse that looked as though time had stopped there. Daniel stepped out of the car, and I noticed his expression change. His face grew serious, almost tense. He stared at the building as if trying to transport himself back to the last time he had been there. "You worked here for a long time?" I asked when he returned with a small box in his hands. "A few years. After the divorce, this place became my lifeline. You know how it is when everything falls apart and you cling to any opportunity you can find? This was mine." He placed the box in the trunk and closed it with a soft thud. We got back into the car, but instead of driving off, he sat there, staring straight ahead. "I thought I'd lost everything back then," he began. "My home, my family, my sense of stability. This place helped me survive. But looking back, I realized it was just a part of the journey. I thought I was rebuilding my life, but really I was hiding from it." I said nothing, because his words struck a chord in me. I often felt that my life wasn't shaped by choices, but by circumstances I'd accepted without question. "Anna, do you know what's the hardest thing?" he continued, turning to face me. "Admitting that you have the right to want more. Acknowledging that you can change something even when it's terrifying." I felt those words land like an arrow in my chest. Fear. It had been holding me back all along. Fear of disrupting the familiar. Fear of stepping into the unknown. On the way back, Daniel talked about his life. How he'd moved between rented apartments. How he'd decided to return to university after years to pursue a new career. His voice was steady, filled with quiet determination. It wasn't a story of failure, but one of resilience. We stopped at a small park along the way. Daniel suggested a walk, and I agreed. The park was mostly empty except for a few joggers and a mother pushing a stroller. We sat on a bench overlooking a lake. The water was dark and calm, reflecting the crimson hues of the setting sun. "It's beautiful here," I said, breaking the silence. "Yes, sometimes you just need to stop and take it all in," he replied, his eyes fixed on the water. This trip turned out to be more than just an errand. It made me reflect on my own past, on the fears I'd been carrying, and on what it means to give yourself permission to hope for a new life. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. We sat quietly on the bench in the park, watching the light dance across the surface of the water. The breeze rustled gently through the trees, and it felt like one of those moments where time stands still. Daniel broke the silence first. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Anna, you deserve more. I can see it in your eyes. I can see that you've lost yourself a long time ago, but you're afraid to admit it." I turned to face him. His words struck a nerve because they were true. They exposed what I had been trying to hide, even from myself. "I don't know how to live any other way," I confessed, my voice trembling. "Every day feels like habit, like routine. I stopped thinking about what I want a long time ago. Maybe I've just gotten used to this state." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was focused, but there was no judgment or pity in his eyes, only a warm understanding. "I used to think that too," he said. that it's better to settle for what you have than to take a risk. But one day I realized that fear can't be your whole life. Otherwise, you're just existing, not living. His words were simple, but they reached deep into me. There were no grand promises or abstract motivations in them, just pure honesty. We both fell silent again. I turned my gaze back to the lake, feeling the cool evening air brush against my skin. The sunset reflected on the water, creating the illusion that the entire world was bathed in a warm, golden glow. "Have you ever thought that you could be happy, Anna?" he asked after a few minutes. His voice was quiet, but his words echoed in my mind. I turned to look at him, and our eyes met. There was so much warmth, so much care in his gaze that I felt something shift inside me. I couldn't look away. This moment was so simple, yet it felt like everything. Our faces drew closer, and we kissed. When we pulled apart, I stared at him, my heart racing and a whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Fear, joy, surprise, release. It all blended together, leaving me breathless. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking at me with tenderness. "I just wanted you to know. You deserve to feel alive." I said nothing, but deep down, I knew this moment had been inevitable. It wasn't an accident. It was a point where our stories, our lives had converged into something greater. And though I didn't know what would come next, for the first time in a long while, I felt real. Returning home after that evening in the park, I felt like the world around me had changed. Although everything looked the same, the house stood where it always had. The shutters were closed. The kitchen light was on. Something inside me had shifted irreversibly. The silence, once ordinary, now pressed down on me. I knew things couldn't continue this way. Michael came home late, as usual. He found me sitting in the living room with a cup of cold tea in my hands. He looked tired, but remained his usual polite self. "You're up late tonight," he said in passing. His tone held no question, no curiosity, just an observation. I took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Michael, we need to talk," I said, and my voice sounded firmer than I expected. He stopped halfway up the stairs, looking back at me with surprise. Something like apprehension flickered in his eyes. He sat down across from me, his posture tense and upright. "What's going on?" he asked. His tone was neutral, but there was a cautious edge to it. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Michael, I can't keep living the way we have been. We've stopped being important to each other a long time ago. We're good partners, but we're not close anymore. I don't feel alive when I'm with you. It's not your fault, and it's not mine. It just happened." He was silent. At first, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then his face tightened, as if he were trying to decipher whether this was a joke. "Are you saying you want to end this?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with uncertainty I had never heard from him before. "I don't want to keep lying to you, or to myself. I'm tired of pretending," I replied, feeling a tremor run through my body. Michael frowned as though preparing to argue, but instead, he just exhaled sharply. "I thought I was doing everything right. I worked. I built a future for us. If I was wrong, why didn't you say anything before?" His words struck a nerve. He was right. I had stayed silent for far too long, hoping things would somehow fix themselves. But that silence had only widened the gulf between us. Because I was scared to destroy what we'd built. But now I realized that pretending any longer would be even worse, I said. He stayed silent for a moment, then got up and walked to the window, staring out at the night cityscape. His shoulders slumped as though carrying the weight of the world. "So this is the end?" he asked at last, without turning around. "I think it's the beginning. For both of us," I replied softly. Michael said nothing as he went upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard the door to our bedroom close. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, contemplating what this meant. The start of a new chapter in my life. A chapter that was frightening, unknown, but finally authentic. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I felt something I hadn't in years. I had taken a step into the unknown, and for the first time in a long while, that step was entirely my own.